I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. Welcome in, everyone. You'll notice for those watching live, we're doing this on a Wednesday. Yes, a Wednesday, we have to accelerate our process. We have to get everything snuck in there because tomorrow, Thanksgiving, not only will we be destroying turkeys, we will be watching 3 NFL games and there's an NFL game on Friday as well. This is just an action-packed slate. This is one of, if not my favorite weeks of the year. I love Thanksgiving. I love football. Let's get right into it. I've got some starts. I've got some sits. And I will leave you with 4 underdog fantasy picks for the good people. Quarterback. Start. CJ Stroud. Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 9 at the Jaguars. Now, the Jaguars are the best matchup for opposing fantasy quarterbacks. Quarterbacks are averaging 6 fantasy points above their average. So if a quarterback's averaging 15 fantasy points per game, they might be expected to score 15 plus 6, 21 fantasy points against the Jaguars. Insane. This is the get-right game for the Texans after the embarrassing loss last week to the Titans. We've got the fully healthy Nico Collins. And you might be like, Josh, you're talking about CJ Stroud. Yes. So there have been a couple bad luck plays where Nico long touchdowns have been called back in recent weeks. We'll talk about CJ Stroud more later in the show as well. So don't worry, we'll talk about him more later. But I think Houston's going to pile on the points. I think they put up 35 to 40 points this week against their division rival Jaguars. Stream at quarterback. Drake Maye. Quarterback 19 versus the Colts. Colts are the 11th best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. So you've got the good matchup, and then we've got Maye's solid rushing floor. He's rushing for around 35-ish yards per game. I think you're going to get 16 to 20 fantasy points out of him this week. It's a pretty good week, I'd say, for quarterbacks, simply because there's no teams on bye, so we have 32 options. But I know a lot of you out there, you complain to me, you go, Josh, you don't understand people hoard quarterbacks in my league. So, okay, that's fine. If Drake Maye's not available, you're desperate, stream Will Levis. I'm not kidding. The consensus quarterback 27. We're scraping the bottom of the barrel right here. Consensus quarterback 27 at the Commanders. Now, the Commanders, it's just an average matchup. I'm not going to lie to you and be like, oh, he's got the smash matchup. But what Levis does have is he's on a 3-game solid run after his injury. So since returning from his shoulder injury, his 3 games since returning, he has at least 16.5 fantasy points in all 3 games, and he's rushed at least 5 times in each game. So he's running a little bit. He's been just good enough as a passer, and we'll take that for fantasy football. Running back. Start Bucky Irving. Consensus by Fantasy Pros. Running back 16 at the Panthers. Panthers are the best matchup for running backs. When you adjust for quality of opponents faced, running back rooms are averaging 7 fantasy points above their season-long average against the Panthers. That's first in the NFL. Now, when we look at the Bucs team total in the betting markets, the betting folks out there think that the Buccaneers are going to score 26 total points. That's the 5th highest on the slate. That's a lot of touchdowns. Bucky carried 12 times, 87 yards, and scored last week versus the Giants. And you might be like, I don't care, Josh, because I saw that Rachaad White had 12 carries too. Yeah, he did, but a lot of those were in garbage time. The Buccaneers were blowing out the Tommy DeVito Giants. And more importantly, Bucky Irving finally started to chip away and steal the majority of the pass game work. He ran 40% more routes than Rachaad White. He caught 6 passes for 64 yards. Rachaad White had 1 catch, 10 yards. Bucky Irving, he's small, he's slow, but he's a workhorse back in an excellent matchup, and he's good at football, and we're starting him. We're also going to start, you can hold your nose for this one, and I've got one more like hold your nose play coming up at running back. You can start Rico Dowdle, consensus running back 23 versus the Giants. Yeah. Now you see it's the Giants. All right. We're just going to pile on the Giants. Now, the Giants are the 6th best matchup for fantasy running backs. The Cowboys are finally Finally, I'm posted up out here in Dallas. I'm not a Cowboys fan, but I can sense the sheer sadness of this fan base. When I deliver my "How about them Cowboys" to unsuspecting people in unsuspecting Dallas elevators, when I see a Cowboys jersey and we're on the elevator together, it is met with tears. People break down, they open up like it's therapy. But folks, the Cowboys are finally favored by 3.5 points against the Giants. I think game script is in Rico Dowdle's favor. You're likely looking at, so initially I was like, I was raking the show sheet and taking notes, and top of my head, I was like, you're probably looking at least 70 to 80 total yards and a touchdown. And then for context, I looked at Underdog Pick Ems after I wrote that down. And Underdog has the total yards for Rico Dowdle set at 87.5. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not the only one that likes Rico Dowdle. The fantasy community is just a little bit behind on liking Rico Dowdle this week. Underdog gave him pretty much a 50-50 chance of scoring a touchdown as well. Also, start Isiah Pacheco, consensus running back 32 versus the Raiders. He was a full practice participant already on Tuesday. He plays the Raiders on Friday. I think he gets a lot of work. The Raiders are the 7th best matchup for fantasy running backs. Kareem Hunt has been fading in recent weeks. I think Pacheco gets the keys to the machine turned back over to him. It might not be like the true bell cow workload this week. I wouldn't expect that, but a really good Friday matchup. I think they're going to try to get him going against the Raiders. I'm going to start him in a couple spots myself. And now if you're desperate in half PPR or full PPR, start Ameer Abdullah, consensus running back 37. We're scraping the bottom. 37 at the Chiefs. Now, this is assuming, so Zamir White's already been ruled out. I think Alexander Mattison might not play as well. We're still waiting. I don't have quite clarity yet on that situation, to be completely honest. But it was an ankle injury. Usually, if it's an ankle injury that keeps a player out, he missed last week, it's generally of the high ankle or a severe low ankle sprain. And generally, those are going to take at least 2 weeks to heal in some form. So assuming that Alexander Mattison also is out, like Zamir White, for this Friday game, it's nice. It's a Friday game. So we know before the Sunday games what's happening here. But it would be Ameer Abdullah. So we had 8 carries last week. We don't care. That doesn't bring home bacon. We want to bring home bacon. You want to know what brings home bacon? We're sticking with bacon. I'm hungry. Ameer Abdullah, I'm not kidding. He ran 49 routes last week. Most receivers, you're pretty happy if they run 30 to 35 routes. Oh my God, Ameer Abdullah was getting his cardio and he ran 49 routes out of the backfield. They just kept, 47 routes out of the backfield. They lined him up out wide for 2 routes. I don't know why, whatever. 49 routes, 6 targets. He catches 5 of them for 37 yards and a touchdown. They're going to trail against the Chiefs probably all game, since it's probably Aiden O'Connell returning from injured reserve. We now have Gardner Minshew heading to injured reserve. It's a terrible situation. And I think, yes, the Chiefs on paper are a brutal matchup for running backs, but Ameer Abdullah is not really being used like a running back. He's almost purely a receiving back with high volume. And I think the Raiders try to make Aiden O'Connell's life easier on Friday afternoon with a lot of dump offs. Wide receiver, start Marvin Harrison Jr., consensus wide receiver 26 at the Vikings. It's simple. The Vikings allow fantasy points to wide receivers. They're a great run defense. And the pass defense, well, it's been pretty good by a lot of advanced football metrics. If we're talking fantasy, they allow a lot of yards and a lot of receptions. That's what we want for fantasy football. I think the Cardinals are going to have to throw. The Cardinals are going to have to throw. We've now seen 7 receivers go over 100 yards against the Vikings. 11 of receivers have at least 78 yards against them. 16 receivers have at least 5 catches against them in just 11 games. If it's ever going to happen, this is the Marvin Harrison Jr. bounce back week. Start Brian Thomas, Fantasy Pros consensus wide receiver 28 versus the Texans. I was shocked at how low people are ranking him. The Texans are an above average matchup. Trevor Lawrence should be back this week. He was already throwing and practicing on Monday. So the expectation is he plays this week. I think Brian Thomas is just a middle of the road fantasy wide receiver 2. Like the fantasy wide receiver, 18, 17-ish is kind of where I'd put him. Consensus has him wide receiver 28. I think that is simply way too low. Start Keenan Allen. Consensus wide receiver 40 at the Lions. Detroit's an elite slot matchup. Unfortunately, I recommended Josh Downs last week. It didn't hit. He had 2 catches on the opening drive, and then Josh Downs suffered a shoulder injury in that game. But we're going right back to the well with Detroit slot matchups because we just root for health. And Keenan Allen's heating up. If we look at his past games, we have 7 targets, 10 targets, 6 targets, 8 targets, 15 targets over the past 5 weeks. That's 9 targets per game. Keenan Allen's heating up. The Bears fired Shane Waldron. Terrible offensive coordinator. Thomas Brown's been much better in that seat. And Bears offense, we all saw it this past week in their overtime close loss to the Vikings. The offense looks a lot better now. And I'm going to be starting Keenan Allen in a couple spots myself. Now, if you're desperate, start the consensus wide receiver 54, Marquez Valdes-Scantling versus the Rams. The Rams are a great matchup for outside receivers. Scantling had at least 87 yards and a touchdown in the 2 games before the Saints bye in week 12. Maybe, just maybe, they're going to dial up a few more plays for him coming out of the bye. I get that the target volume's low, but we're looking for dart throws, and the Rams have really struggled to cover the outside. Jonnu Smith, start him at tight end. Consensus tight end 8 at the Packers. I get things wrong all the time. I admit when I get those things wrong. But one thing I've been getting right this year is Jonnu Smith. I have told you to start Jonnu Smith so many times on this show. Jonnu Smith just keeps killing it for the good people. Now, the Packers are the 7th best matchup for tight ends. Jonnu has at least 8 targets, 6 catches, 87 yards, and a score each of the past 2 games. If we go back to the past 7 games, he's averaging 7 targets, 5.5 catches, 65 yards, 15.5 fantasy points per game. Just perennially underrated, Jonnu Smith. And perennially underrated, this is one I got wrong early in the year, and then I course corrected, and we've been starting him. I got Hunter Henry wrong early in the year. I didn't respect Drake Maye enough. I didn't respect the role enough. We've been right on this most of the time the last few weeks now. Start Hunter Henry, consensus tight end 12 versus the Colts. Colts are the 3rd best matchup for opposing fantasy tight ends. Tight end rooms have averaged 3 fantasy points above their average this year against the Colts, 3rd best. Hunter Henry has at least 6 targets in 5 of his past 6 games, and he has at least 8 targets in 3 of his past 4 games. However you slice and dice it, Hunter Henry has a great role for a tight end. It's a good matchup against the Colts. He's got the solid target floor. I don't know what more you need there.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick 'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than, you 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins-Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson had 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog Pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
I'm Josh Larky. Welcome back to the Dominator. For those of you out there, we covered the fantasy starts. We're going to cover the fantasy sits, and we've got those Underdog fantasy pick'ems. Just some quick housekeeping work. Self-promotion wise, I'm on Twitter at JLarkyTweets, on Blue Sky at Josh Larky. Make sure to check me out. I'm giving you if you like these fantasy point adjusted matchups, I have my full charts for every player, every position. Yes, on the Twitter, on the Blue Sky, at JLarkyTweets on Twitter, at Josh Larky on Blue Sky. I put out full fantasy rankings last week. They did really well, not just engagement-wise, but I mean, we were crushing the players I had above and below consensus. Go back and look at those, and you'll be like, oh, this guy knows what he's doing. I didn't have time earlier in the year to rank, but I've done rankings for years and years, and we're going to try to like keep sneaking those in this week. I don't know where I find the time. I lose sleep. The bags under my eyes keep growing. Maybe I need to start filtering the camera for the streams. Anyway, we got a few questions in the chat. Someone says, I have both Madison and Abdullah. Great. If Madison sits, start Abdullah. I don't think I'd play Madison against the Chiefs this week, though I don't think it's terrible. All right. Someone says, Jaden Reed or Calvin Ridley, assuming Juwan Jennings is a bench regardless of quarterback. I mean, I wouldn't assume Juwan Jennings is a bench if Purdy plays, but I do really like Calvin Ridley. I stopped talking about Calvin Ridley on this show because we started him too many times, and I can't just say the same player every single week. But I will. Let's talk sits. Quarterback. We'll go back to the well. He flopped last week. I told you to sit him. I'm going to tell you to sit him one more time. Jared Goff is the consensus quarterback 12 versus the Bears, and we're going to sit him. So the Bears. They're brutal against quarterbacks. Quarterbacks are averaging nearly 3 fantasy points below their season-long average against the Bears. The Bears, though, on the other hand, are the 5th best matchup for running backs. It's a run funnel defense. Expect a lot of Jahmyr Gibbs. Expect a lot of David Montgomery. David Montgomery did have the shoulder injury. He was banged up last week. David Montgomery, and Dan Campbell both said David Montgomery will play on Thanksgiving. And you might be like, well, how can I guarantee it? I need one more piece, Josh. Give me one more piece of info to guarantee he plays. Revenge game. You're welcome. You're welcome. David Montgomery, Bears revenge game. If you think Jared Goff is getting the touchdowns this week, welcome to Narrative Street. David Montgomery, 2 scores. Book it. Anyway, Jared Goff has the highest pass touchdown rate of his career because we need a little more information before we can sit a guy. So Jared Goff has the highest pass touchdown rate of his career. Yet he's still the quarterback 13 in fantasy points per game. So tell me why he's the quarterback 12 in a tough matchup when, it doesn't make sense. Running back, sit Tony Pollard. Consensus running back 21 at the Commanders. So he had a massive workload in week 12 against the Texans. Tony Pollard was awesome. I had him really high in my fantasy rankings on Twitter. I was like, guys, Tony Pollard, it's Tony Pollard week because Tajay Spears is out with a concussion. Sure enough, Tony Pollard, 24 carries, 119 yards and a touchdown. He even was targeted 5 times. He caught 3 passes for 10 yards, absolute smash. But if that was week 12. Let's go back to week 10. Tony Pollard, 13 touches. Tajay Spears, 10. Week 11, Pollard, 11 touches. Tajay Spears, 5. Tajay Spears should return this week. I think it's some type of committee again. Washington's just an average matchup. The touchdown upside is going to be a little bit lower this week. And the Titans team total is just 19.5 points. It's the 6th lowest in week 13. Like Will Levis, I said you could start him if you're desperate, but hey, there's a reason the consensus has Will Levis, quarterback 27. There's not much expectation for the Titans offense. I think it's a committee again for Pollard. Another running back we got right last week, and unfortunately we have to sit him again this week, is DeAndre Swift. Consensus running back 26 at the Lions. Lions are the 2nd worst matchup for opposing fantasy running backs. 2nd worst matchup. Last week he faced the Vikings, and you might be like, Josh, you told me to sit him against the Vikings. What's going on? Vikings were I'm not kidding, folks. Vikings were the 3rd worst matchup for running backs last week. This week, the Lions are the 2nd worst. It just, poor DeAndre Swift. It's a string of bad matchups. And then we look and we remember, oh my God, box score. We watch the tape. Roshan Johnson vultured another touchdown from DeAndre Swift last week. I think against the Lions, you're probably getting inefficient carries, some pass game work, not much else. Yes, it is the revenge game narrative. So if you want to play the revenge game narrative with DeAndre Swift, go for it. I think I'd rather play that with David Montgomery, who's just in a much better offensive ecosystem and has a smash matchup. If you want to play narrative street and tell me told you so because DeAndre Swift pops off, go for it. I would advise against it. I would advise against starting Gus Edwards, consensus running back 35 at the Falcons. I'm assuming J.K. Dobbins misses week 13 with his knee injury. We have no information about that as of right now. Let's look at Gus Bus. So Gus Bus has less than half a reception per game in his career. He does not catch passes. He did not catch a pass last week. Atlanta has allowed just 3 rushing touchdowns all year. It's not a great matchup for Gus Bus. I don't really see how fading Gus Edwards hurts you this week. Now, before we get to receivers, before we get to the Underdog Pick Ems, a few questions in the chat. Someone's asking who has the best matchup between Zay Flowers and Calvin Ridley. Top of my head, I don't remember. Twitter, @JLarky tweets. I have full matchups out for every single player. Receiver, slot receivers, outside receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, tight ends. That's where you should be looking for all the matchups. Someone says, drop Jonathan Brooks for Gus Edwards. Yes, I would do that. God, poor Jonathan Brooks. He had 5 snaps last week. Just unbelievable. Producer D in the chat says, looking good, buddy. I can't tell if that was about someone's start sit or about how I look. We'll assume it's about how I look. Keep the compliments coming. We had a couple last week. I've been on, I'm not even kidding, a new face washing routine. I should become an influencer for them before I tell you who it is. But it's this thing on Amazon. It was like $25. And I do the face wash routine each week. I think the glow is happening. My girlfriend's been very complimentary. So I hope these comments in the chat are about that. I know last year, I'll admit, I didn't take care of my face the way I should. The beard didn't look as good. I know like 3 years ago, I was getting lambasted for TikToking with a neck beard, which I thought was hilarious. And it was ugly. I'm sorry. I know looks matter for the content creators. I'm trying, folks. I'm trying. Receiver. Sit Zay Flowers. Consensus. We were trying to stay in character. Sit Zay Flowers. Consensus. Wide receiver 19 versus the Eagles. Eagles are a brutal matchup. There's no teams on bye this week. I've got Zay Flowers as more of this fantasy wide receiver 3 type rather than a must-start wide receiver 2. He has a low floor this week. I'm not saying like every team's going to sit him, but I think most of you will have better options. So there you go, Zay Flowers, chat person. And then Khalil Shakir, he's the consensus wide receiver 27 versus the Niners. I'm leaning towards sit status for him. You probably have better options. You likely drafted Khalil Shakir in like the 9th, 10th, 11th round of fantasy. You probably have better options. So Khalil Shakir against the 49ers. It's the 4th worst slot matchup. He's a slot receiver, a pure slot receiver. I'm anticipating that Keon Coleman will play again this week after the bye, along with Amari Cooper. So Khalil Shakir's got solid target competition, a tough matchup, and his average depth of target the past 3 games, week 9, 10, 11 before the bye, was about 4 yards downfield. Pitiful. He only kills you in fantasy if he's getting heavy volume. I just don't see that this week. Now, I've got no particular tight end sits this week. No particular tight end sits. I don't want to lie to the people and manufacture stuff. I'm not going to do that. So I'm not going to do that. Someone said, is Taysom Hill a potential start over Njoku? I don't have a preference there. I think Njoku is going to have a higher floor this week. Taysom Hill is going to have a higher ceiling. You can always have the rug pulled out from you with Taysom Hill where he does nothing. So I think that's how I have that situation. Lastly, before we get to those underdog pick'ems, we got one more question in the chat. What role do I think Kamani Vidal has with the Chargers? Great question. So we've got Gus Edwards, grinder back, 15 to 20 carries. We know what Gus Edwards is. Hassan Haskins. So Jim Harbaugh, Chargers head coach, actually was the Michigan head coach with Hassan Haskins a few years ago in college. He likes the guy. But Hassan Haskins, think of him kind of like Jordan Howard on the Dolphins. He's probably going to get a few carries. He might vulture a touchdown. That's about it. These are both big bruising backs without pass catching upside. So I think Kamani Vidal, it's concerning that he's been a healthy scratch the last few weeks. They kept scratch. But I do think he's the only guy right now in this offense and in this running back depth chart that profiles as a pass catcher. So I think he could actually see a decent workload as a pass catching back. I would just keep your hopes down in terms of what we should actually expect in terms of like rushing workload. I think could be very, very low. Start Devontae Adams or Marvin Harrison Jr. Chat, I see the questions. Jordan Love, Jane Daniels. Follow me on Twitter at JLarkyTweets. I'm working on fantasy rankings. I should have those out either later today or tomorrow morning to help you all this week. At JLarkyTweets on Twitter, at Josh Larky on Blue Sky. Producer tells me I got to wrap it up. All right. Underdog fantasy picks, folks. First one, we got 4 of them. CJ Stroud, higher than 248.5 passing yards. Quarterbacks against the Jaguars are 7-4 to the over. So we like that against Jaguars. And then in the 7 games CJ Stroud's played with Nico Collins this year, he's averaging 270 passing yards per game. We got the fully healthy Nico. We got the great matchup. We're rooting for CJ Stroud. Another great matchup, Bucky Irving, higher 59.5 rushing yards. The Panthers are allowing 130 rushing yards per game to running backs. 11 running backs have at least 59 rushing yards versus the Panthers this year. The only teams not to have a running back go over this number against the Panthers this year, Broncos, Raiders. Neither of those are the poster child for good, effective run games. Bucky Irving, higher, 59.5. Jonnu Smith, higher, 42.5 receiving yards. The Packers are the good matchup to begin with. Over the past 7 games since Jonnu Smith picked up steam, the past 7 games, he's 6-1 to the over. He's averaging 65 yards per game during that time. And we got to give you a lower Tony Pollard, lower 62.5 rushing yards. So Pollard is coming off that 24 carry game in week 12. We've got Tyjae Spears returning from the concussion. It's going to be a committee game, most likely, once again. Pollard had exactly 9 carries the past 2 games when he was playing with Tyjae Spears. Game script should be bad. They're 5.5-point underdogs against the Commanders. I just don't think it's Tony Pollard week. I do think it's the Dominator week. Fantasy football, week 13. Start, sits. It's Thanksgiving. Everyone eat some turkey. Thank you to the good people for sticking with me on this Wednesday morning. This was so much fun. And best of luck out there as we make that fantasy football playoff push.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.